Okay, so I'll get going with the introduction. Welcome, everybody. My name is Lloyd Trotman. I'm a professor in cancer research at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. And it is my special pleasure to host this event of our public lecture series. And our guest today is Kevin Cassel from the University of Hawaii Cancer Center. Kevin had been invited exactly a year ago, or pretty much exactly a year ago, and that was probably one of the last trips that he had been taking, and it was definitely the last person that we had been actively inviting because the first week of March, when he was supposed to speak, we went into lockdown. So we're really, really happy that everybody learned how to deal with this situation, and we were able to get Kevin back for this lecture today. So Kevin has been, he is an assistant professor in the population sciences program at the University of Hawaii Cancer Center. And the amazing thing about Kevin's research is essentially the enormous success that his line of work has had. And the best way to illustrate that is in the audience, everybody will know about the various trials and how hard it has been to do all those various trials over the past years for the COVID vaccines and getting these thousands and thousands of people on board. And everybody knows now that these trials must include very strict guidelines in order to make sure that the diversity of our population is entirely captured and that they will be safe and working for everybody. And this general knowledge, which is new even to some of us in science, demonstrates the huge impact and the huge importance of the kind of work that Kevin has been doing, because Kevin has, from the get-go, had a focus on community and patients in his work on cancer. So as you can imagine, that huge success in all of us realizing how important representation in trials, among others, did not come overnight. So Kevin started this kind of interest in cancer science some 25 years ago. He grew up in Philadelphia and was at Fox Chase on the phone line of the Cancer Information Service. And that's where he realized how important it is to form this bridge between the huge work that the government is doing to get better cancer information and to get that information to the people with cancer. And so he's been always following that focus. And while doing his post-bac work at the University of Hawaii, ending up with a Ph.D. then in translational research. He was again working as an education coordinator of the Cancer Center of the University of Hawaii. And his work has then always been on the best way to translate cancer control into and healthcare politics for people. And so his talk today will be Defeating Cancer, Working with Communities to Conduct Better Cancer Research. And I'd like to emphasize to all the audience that the questions that you have can be put in a special Q&A section where we'll get to them after the talk. So without any further ado, Kevin, it's really great to finally have you here. I can't wait to hear your talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lloyd. It's my great pleasure to be here. I'm happy to finally be able to give this talk. As mentioned, we had planned this about a year ago. It was in the midst of the COVID outbreak. So I really feel fortunate to be able to talk with you all now. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen on my slides. So as mentioned, I'm Kevin Cassel. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Hawaii Cancer Center. And the talk today, I'm going to actually break the talk into two different parts. The first part is just going to be on my research focus, some of the things that I do in terms of my movement of science, And then I'm going to talk more detail about how strategies for working with communities, for both population-based science, laboratory science, and as well as clinical trials, some of the key strategies that I've learned over the past 25 years of getting real community involvement in cancer research. So that's kind of the outline of the talk today. So as mentioned, I work in population science. I do what are called evidence-based program implementation. These are evidence-based programs are population-based cancer control interventions that are proven through research. These are interventions that have been developed through effectiveness studies that have been done in the past, similar to the way clinical trials and clinical practice guidelines are used in medicine. We have some strategies that have been proven to be effective to reach populations to reduce their cancer risk, similar to the way we do treatment, and we have repositories of evidence-based programs for therapeutics, such as the physician's data query in medicine. In population science, one of our repositories is the Cancer Control Planet. This is a listing of many different types of cancers that can be prevented are listed here with research tested programs. And we have strategies that are used to make these programs effective in different populations. So just to give some more background about evidence-based programs, there are a lot of different types of evidence-based programs that we use in population science. We have evaluated programs that are going through rigorous studies. They've been reviewed by authorities and experts in the field, and these are called model programs. We have other evidence-based programs that are informed through the literature. They have shown effectiveness in individual studies, and these are called effective programs. And then we have programs that are promising. These are programs that are just being developed. They are kind of grassroots programs. They're based upon personal experience or tacit knowledge or individual program evaluations. They're shown to be promising. So that's kind of the nomenclature for evidence-based programs that we use to look at the different levels of evidence and how effective they may be. So as I mentioned, we have repositories of these evidence-based programs. This is Cancer Control Planet. We have a litany, hundreds of programs that have been shown to be effective for different populations. For instance, the topics include breast cancer, diet and nutrition, survivorship. And in this repository, it actually talks about, it describes the research that have been done in the past. It gives the resources that have been used, and it describes the populations that they have been proven to be effective with as they went through their research processes. But one of the things about it is that these evidence-based programs, they're only as good sometimes as the people that they were tested on. So the question is, what good is science if it doesn't help us all? So that's the question. So what I do basically is take these evidence-based programs from these efficacy studies and try to adapt them to be useful for real-world conditions. So taking those experimental programs and looking at the different settings that they were used in and trying to adapt them for different populations. For instance, we have skin cancer programs that were developed for elementary school kids, maybe adapting them for a different population. One of the things that we look to in terms of fitting the program and maintaining the science is to make sure we deliver the program with fidelity and looking at and understanding some of the core components or active ingredients of that effective program. And this is kind of the illustration of how I feel about taking these studies and beefing them up to be able to address these real world conditions. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what I do. And this is kind of a schema of implementation and dissemination science. I talked about the efficacy studies, defining whether a program could work, effectiveness studies, does the program work, and then actually taking the program in real world condition and implementing it in a setting, looking at adoption and preparation in the setting, implementation and sustainment in the setting. So that's kind of a quick, brief overview about implementation and dissemination science and some of the work that I do. Now, how do I do it? This is the really important part. What I use is a paradigm called community-based participatory research. Now, this is a new model. It's been around for, well, not relatively new, for about a few years. Since about 1997, we really started adopting this into public health and prevention practice. It's really a reaction to objective research methodology. Standard scientific method was used to study human experience, and researchers were in the past were seen as impassionate observers. So this created limited knowledge, and participants were seen as subjects. We call this kind of research helicopter research. The researcher is devoid and removed from the actual process of being studied, when actually the process of being studied should include the researcher. So this led to the development of community-based participatory research. There are actually two major traditions. One is the Northern tradition, and this was built out of industrial hygiene and organizational change, talking with workers in factories to make the components of factory work more effective and really suit human conditions. It was used to, knowledge in that sense was used to create for a purpose, to make the factories better or to improve the way your car functions. And then there's the Southern tradition started by Paulo Freire in South America, where he was looking at what we call emancipatory knowledge, letting people know some of the data about risk factors that were being experienced, particularly for women in South America, high rates of cervical cancers, and talking with the women and talking with the community about whether this was important to them, and making sure that the research fit the community interests, and then building a program of intervention that was designed around the community and the way the community functions. Not only examining and screening people for cervical cancer, but actually treating them on the spot, understanding that you had limited opportunities to engage women. So this is kind of the overview of community-based participatory research. It's really working to engage communities. There are several key principles to community-based participatory research. The first, of course, is recognizing the community. The community can be anything. It can be an ethnic community. It could be a geographic community. It could be a gender-based community. But really understanding what your community is and what you're trying to achieve is one of the first steps in really using this methodology. The other thing is building upon the strengths and resources within the community. Oftentimes, as researchers, we look at problems and we try to address problems, but we miss sometimes the fact that the community has some strengths that can be leveraged to really address problems. So looking at a holistic or addressing health from an ecological view is important. Another principle is facilitating collaborative partnerships. Academics and community should be looked at upon as equals, in the research process. Integrating knowledge into action. One of the things I always try to do is to make sure that I'm not just studying something just to get more knowledge, but it has a purpose to improve lives. Promoting co-learning and empowering process. This is another, I think, key principle where co-learning, researchers, I as a researcher, when I work with communities, I learn as much as the community does about the research process, to try to have that knowledge transfer be bi-directional. And using a cyclic and iterative process of learning upon learning, as we get new things done, we take that progress and we build upon it. Then I think a really important thing is disseminating findings and knowledge to all partners. I work with some really strong communities, and they understand that the data that we collect from them, it's their data. They have ownership of it. So it's a privilege, and we have to acknowledge the fact that we have the privilege of being able to collect information from communities and really support sharing those findings with our communities. And then finally is to support long-term partner commitment. So, in terms of research that I mentioned before, in terms of the evidence base, the idea is that if research should influence community practice, then community practice should influence research. And that's kind of the whole concept surrounding community-based participatory research. So now I'm going to talk about just giving you some background about CBPR and community engagement. I'm going to talk about some things that I've learned over the past 25 years in working with communities. And the first thing is good intentions are not enough. So my background, as mentioned, I started in Fox Chase at the Cancer Information Service. I was answering phone calls. This is me as a child when I first started. I worked as an outreach specialist. I worked with several different types of populations, Hispanic populations, because I spoke Spanish, African-American populations, and rural Appalachian populations in Pennsylvania. So one of the first projects I was involved with as an outreach coordinator was looking at this Quit Today campaign. Around that time, the tobacco industry was really targeting African-American communities with these products. So we had started a research project looking at a media project where we were encouraging African-American smokers to call the Cancer Information Service for smoking cessation information and materials. As a part of that media campaign, we also had community outreach where we went into communities, African-American communities, and we gave out guides, and we had a videotape designed to motivate smokers to quit and call the CIS. So this was to be widely disseminated. In my office, we served Philadelphia, and then I got the opportunity to go out and meet with some community folks in Atlantic City. So if you don't remember, or if you're young enough to not know about this, back in the 1993, this was Atlantic City. It was before this time, it was really just a boardwalk, but it was being developed into these really huge casinos. There was a lot of progress being made in Atlantic City. So, but when I went to the African-American community, this is what I found. I didn't see that progress. I saw blight. And when I talked to community members about establishing a smoking cessation program, they were like, well, thank you, but no thanks. We have more pressing concerns. Members were being forced from their homes. There was a loss of neighborhood businesses, increased crime from transient, drug use was up. So I learned the value, even though I was there to help, I learned the value of what we now call community engaged research. Despite being there to help, they were like, thank you, Mr. Government Man, but we need help in these areas. We'll pass on trying to start this campaign. So it really got me to thinking about, really learning to engage with communities first before we start to try to, encourage them to conduct research. So the lesson I learned, as scientists, we may have good intentions towards working towards the greater good, but that doesn't always translate into the tangible needs of community. We need to take efforts to identify the community context, understand what's going on in communities, and really develop an introspection about why we're doing the research. Are we doing the research just to further knowledge, or are we doing the research to make sure that good things happen and we are working to improve lives? So that's the first thing, good intentions. So the next thing is knowing the community and knowing the context. So as mentioned, I worked at Fox Chase. I applied for a job in Honolulu, Hawaii at the Cancer Research Center of Hawaii. I applied, this was back in 1995. We didn't have internet access. We didn't have Zoom linkages. So my interview was conducted over the phone. So when I came to, I had never even met my supervisors or the staff members that I was going to work with, but they knew me because I was the only idiot getting off the plane with a suit and tie on, coming to Hawaii, where everybody else was coming for leisure. So they pointed me out and said, "That's our guy. This idiot with the suit and tie on the plane to Hawaii. He must be our new employee." So I got to Hawaii, and this is what I expected to see. The pristine beaches and all this beautiful environment. But what I actually saw was the urban blight, the struggles, the disparities. These are real pictures. These are recent pictures of communities in Hawaii. This is a homeless community in downtown Honolulu currently. And there was actually a political struggles. The Native Hawaiian people felt disenfranchised. They lost ownership of their land, which I'll talk about later. They were, really feeling tremendous health-related disparities related to social determinants of health, poor access to education, opportunities for good jobs, incarceration. These type of issues were challenging the indigenous people of Hawaii, and they were in flux. Didn't realize these are some of the housing projects in Oahu, and on each of the neighbor islands, there are communities like this. This, I'm not sure people realize, but the Native Hawaiian have what we call homestead communities. These are similar to what would be reservations for Native Americans. There's land that's set aside for Native Hawaiians it was supposed to be for their empowerment. This is an urban community, homestead community in urban Oahu. But as you can see, this house, can you imagine being a senior citizen needing to come up these stairs every day to your home and how precariously it sits relative to the mountain. These are some of the types of issues that I learned quickly and understood quickly. So again, with part of understanding and knowing the community, I would give you a little bit more background about the U.S. Associated Pacific. We have, what we call territories, including Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, and Samoa. And we have COFA states, Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. So our U.S. territories, they don't have any votes in the presidential election. The representatives in the House have no vote. And these jurisdictions have middle to third world economies. Even though they're part of the US, their economies are really, really struggling. Then we have the Compacts of Free Association. These are Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. They were granted after World War II to be supported by the US because of our military presence. And these folks can come from these countries into the US without visas or time constraints. And there's been tremendous exodus to Hawaii and Guam for jobs, and recently to the mainland for jobs from these COFA, what we call COFA jurisdictions. Some of the health risk factors, that are unique to the Pacific Islands. We do have about 10,000 annual cases of cancer relative to a population of about 2.3 million. The cancer sites are pretty standard, the most common sites being lung, prostate, colorectal. But there are some unique challenges for these populations: high rates of liver cancers and extremely high rates of cervical cancers. This is one of the highest rates of cervical cancers in the world, 18.3 compared to 7.2 for the US rates. High rates of nasopharyngeal cancers, and these are related to behavioral risk factors. In the jurisdictions, not only do they have access to some of these challenging and carcinogenic products like tobacco use, there's lots of obesity-related disease, and screening tests. The healthcare infrastructure mirrors that of third world countries. They don't have access to screening tests or basic diagnostic tests. And as a result, we see these extremely high morbidity rates, with percent of people dead within 5 years of diagnosis, 70% in Palau, 94% in Costa Rica. Really, really high rates of death and morbidity related to cancer because of the limited infrastructure for healthcare. But understanding the history of Pacific Islander peoples, this wasn't the norm. This happened as a result of Western influence. Before Western contact, migrants, the Pacific Island peoples, were physically active. These people were selected, the migration coming from Southeast Asia, you consider them like astronauts today. They were selected because of their fitness, because of their exemplary ability to adapt. And they were challenged, being able to be challenged by the long oceanic voyages. So the people who inhabited these islands, really had extremely good cultural practices, meticulous hygiene, physically active. And this is a representation of what the first sailors saw, when they came to the Pacific Islands, really robust and fit people. But as a result of Western contact, there were diseases decimated nearly 70 to 90% of these populations, the smallpox and other infectious diseases. So even today, Native Hawaiians still face health and social welfare challenges that are disproportionate to those experienced by other ethnic groups in the states. High rates of heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes. And these basically are related to social determinants of health. Depopulation, land dispossession. And land dispossession is really, people don't realize how important this is to Native Hawaiian culture. In Native Hawaiian culture, the land and the plants, the staple plant, which is taro, is thought of as the firstborn of the gods, and to be a brother to mankind. So there's really a reverence for the land and how it is connected to health. So this led to a lot of detrimental health behaviors, such as elevated tobacco, alcohol use, diets, and high fat and energy. But recently there's been a resurgence. In the 1985, there was the Native Hawaiian Healthcare Act, which established the Native Hawaiian healthcare system People have heard about the Hokulea and the voyaging canoe that sailed around the world. The development of the John A. Burns School of Medicine in creating a pathway for medical practitioners from the Native Hawaiian community, and really just a resurgence of culture and what we call culture as intervention. And I'll talk more about a little bit about that later, how we use culture as intervention, and that can be applied in other communities as well. But the important thing is to know about these communities. Finally, I want to talk about the reason for our, the responsibility that the U.S. has to these COFA and Pacific Island nations. These nations were turned over as to the military to the U.S. because of the military presence. And a lot of this was due to the fact that most of the nuclear testing was done. This is point zero for nuclear testing. This occurred between 1942 and all the way up until 1962. This is above ground testing. It actually decimated a lot of the islands, particularly in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. The fallout affected this entire region. And we still see today some of the resources or some of the challenges that are resulting from this nuclear testing. A lot high rates of cancers, such as Hodgkin's disease, lymphomas, and things like that, related to exposure to radiation. So we do have a lot of migrants from these COFA nations to Hawaii and to Guam, about 1.5% of our populations. Really high rates of preventable cancers. This is one cancer I don't understand, and I have to understand in the context of culture, because about 18.3, given that we've had PAP testing since 1964, this is kind of, it's strange to me, 18% rates per 100,000 versus 7.2 in the US populations, despite the fact that we have effective treatments or screening for cervical cancers. And these are related to cultural norms. Oral cancer, 7% of all cases related to a cultural norm of using what's called areca nut and tobacco. This is a status symbol in some of the Pacific Island jurisdictions. So, as I mentioned, the first thing for me to do was to really understand the context and the community itself, knowing about their challenges, the history. A lot of this was found in electronic databases. A lot of it can be searched, through organizational websites and gray literature, but it's really important to really understand the historical and cultural background of the populations that you work with so that you can engage them in a better way. So in the context of COVID, I wanted to, talk about this in the context of COVID. We have some disparities that we're seeing in infection rates right now in Hawaii related to COVID. And these, again, we see high rates, and even though Pacific Islander populations only, as mentioned, approximate 3% of our population, almost 30% of the cases for COVID are found in Pacific Islanders. High rates among Filipino populations, high rates among Native Hawaiians relative to their population rate, their percentage in the population. So what we understand is that in the context of COVID, how important these contributing factors are. Socioeconomic factors, 24% of Pacific Islanders are essential workers. They live in multi-generational housing, dense neighborhoods, high representation in homelessness and prison populations. So these are kind of mirror populations that are on the mainland. Some of the same socioeconomic factors contribute to high rates in communities, not only in Hawaii, our Pacific Islander populations, but across the country. But looking at it from a strengths perspective, we do have opportunities to intervene. One thing about communal cultures, there is a lot of unity and resiliency. There's a context of caring, a malama, and there's the idea of helping without being asked. It's the kokua. So we can hopefully leverage some of these strengths to address some of these contributing factors for COVID infections. So the next thing I want to do is talk about asking the community. And I think this is one of the first steps of actually really engaging the community, is getting there and asking them, what is important to you? How can I research? Being able to explain the research in plain language and getting input from community members. So this was one of the first projects I was charged with delivering in in Hawaii. It was a project called Body and Soul. It was shown to be effective in reducing cancer risk working through African-American churches. Unfortunately, in Hawaii, we only had 2 African-American churches, so the opportunity for impact was very low. So the idea was, well, perhaps I can adapt this intervention for a similar population. Samoans have a similar affinity for churches. A lot of people attend church. They have similar risk for energy balance related diseases. So the idea was, could I adapt Body and Soul to fit Samoans? So the first thing I wanted to do is to gain entree in the community was to identify a champion, someone, what we call key informant in qualitative research, but basically a champion, someone in the community that has positional or vocational influence that can help validate the information that I found in the literature about that community. I luckily found a Samoan pastor. He was part of a council of churches. And he explained a lot to me about how this would work. I wanted to know, is it okay for me being a Black man going into the Samoan community and talking about energy balance issues? So, he gave me a lot of information about how to do that. He talked about the importance of respect in the Samoan culture and how it pervades their whole society. The Fa'asamo, the Samoan way, is based upon respect. Then he talked to me, of course, about knowing a little bit about the culture, knowing some of the cultural norms and how to be respectful, understanding there are strict gender norms within the community, there are strict hierarchical norms within the community. And then, he explained to me about, what types of things that could be used to leverage an intervention, that people were really technologically astute, which we wouldn't assume, but, talking to a champion who would know, we found out that to be true. So the next step in terms of talking to the community, once I had entree in the community, I wanted to test to see, well, we're going to do this in a church. What about people who aren't in churches? So the next part was to I spent time in the church. I actually spent a lot of time in the church, for months and months before I did any research, just to build that trust between myself and the church membership. And I also did some what we call key informant interviews as well, looking at people who are not church members. How does the church play a role in their lives? And they explained to me that even though they weren't part of the church community, they used the church. It was kind of a rialto for, cultural ceremonies. They go to weddings, they go to funerals. And I was, impressed by that. And it came true. It was exemplified when I was sitting in church one day. And of course, one of the people that I talked to who wasn't a church member came in for a wedding celebration. So finally, in terms of asking the community, a really important piece is to conduct discussion groups. Finding people that have interest or have influence in the community from their vocation or from their position or, just from the respect that community members have. You want to build these discussion groups. You can ask questions about your research, whether or not it's important to them. You want to present what we call emancipatory knowledge. If there's an issue that your research is addressing that the community may not be aware of, you can present that. But you want to, as you mentioned, do your homework. Make sure you understand some of the norms. For instance, in Pacific Island communities, we don't mix men and women. The groups need to be separate. We don't mix younger and older. There's a propensity when you do that it will hinder certain people from actually talking because they have to defer to the higher status members of the community. This is a good opportunity when you hold these discussion groups to actually do some co-learning. What I usually do, and I'll talk more about this later, is I train the community members to do the qualitative research, to hold the discussion groups. And the importance about these discussion groups, so a lot of people think of discussion groups in terms of, getting a sample size and making sure you generalize the information. That's really not important. Really what you want to do is you want to reach what we call saturation, thematic saturation. When you hear the group members talking about the same things over and over again, you realize that you hit upon a certain truth and that you actually understand the community and the theoretical processes that are working within the community. So that's the idea behind asking the community. Another thing, after you had these discussion groups and you want them to establish a community advisory board. Again, select people that may come from a range of community perspectives. You want to train the members about what to expect and what you expect them to do. We have a community advisory board that we just started for the Native Hawaiian community here in Hawaii. We have people from all walks of life, from kuma hula or expert hula instructors to vice president of Hawaiian Airlines to physicians, and we define the expectations for the group. We ask them to review some of the papers, some of the research, and finding out how suitable will this be, and how can we introduce this research project into the community in a safe way, in a respectful way. And that's what we do. And design the advisory boards for sustainability, compensate them. It doesn't always have to be financial. Sometimes it's just a gesture, a small gift, or whatever, something that shows appreciation and to value the input that these advisory boards are making into your research. So now I'm going to talk about a specific project in terms of asking the community. I'll go through this pretty quickly for time, but this was adapting SunSafe. We wanted to look at intervention for skin cancer prevention that have been tested on elementary school kids, and we want to adapt it for high school kids. One of the things about it is that we're working with a multi-ethnic population here in Hawaii. There are some issues, surrounding complexion. People with darker complexion don't feel as though they have risk for skin cancers when they actually are equivalent. High rates in people who are highly pigmented for melanomas, higher rates for people who are fair complected based on squamous cell cancers. So in order to conduct this research, first thing we did was we asked the students. We held discussion groups with high school students. Now, I didn't lead these groups. Again, this was an opportunity for co-learning. I didn't want, the reactivity from me as an adult talking with some high school students, they're not going to be as forthright. So we actually trained some students who were closer in age to high school students. They led the discussion groups with the students, and we got some really good information. And we actually had interviews with teachers and principals about what they wanted to see in an intervention project. And this is some of the things that we found from talking with the students. They thought that skin appearance was important. Of course, they wanted to be attractive to the opposite sex, so they exposed more skin. They thought skin cancers were occurring in later in life, no risk for younger people, unaware about excisional treatments, the lopping off of face, arms, and hands. The sunscreens were seen as sticky and not worth the effort. And then one thing we really learned was they wanted reminder cues. They wanted to know something to remind them or give them a cue about when they needed to perform their sun protective behaviors. So this led up to us developing the intervention components. We had a classroom session. We had a session for parents and teachers where we actually had screenings, and we actually had our intervention component using some objective measures of sun protection. And these are some of the materials that were based upon the input from the students. We actually showed pictures, illustrations of skin cancer treatment, what skin cancers look like, depictions of early aging. And I think one of the most important things we had in this project was this cue. We had a sun protection bracelet. This was a UV reactive bracelet that changed colors when they were exposed to the sun. So the students would have a real definitive cue about now it's time to seek shade, wear your hat, or to use some kind of a barrier protection. And of course, the teachers wanted pens. So we created pens with sun protection messages on it to appease the teachers. So that was just an illustration of how the benefits of asking the community, how it can inform the success and your better research. So the next thing I want to talk about is involving the community. It's one thing to ask them, but it's another thing to involve them. So we call this kind of concept in the Pacific Islanders, coming with your baskets full. As researchers, you're going to be taking data, you're going to be getting things of value from your community. You want to be able to give back as part of that process and have the understanding that this is going to be mutually beneficial. So as I mentioned before, a lot of what I do is I train community members to perform aspects of the research. And, this is important, to have them feel involved. And, we actually use a lot of focus groups. We train moderators and those types of things. Really, training and qualitative research is one of the ways that I try to empower the community with research and understanding research a little bit better. Then it's the other idea of providing appropriate resources or appropriate incentives. We had a study where we were testing cervical cancer screening, and we wanted to test and see, since we knew that there people were using a lot of the technology, whether or not text messaging would support adoption of Pap testing. So one of the things we did, since we're working, unfortunately, a lot of our Micronesian and COFA migrants live in public housing. These are some of the public housing communities. So we went in, we actually offered phones as part of the research project. You know, the phones would support the text messaging, but the participants got to actually keep the phones after the study was done. Another thing, we actually went out to the community members. We didn't ask them to come to us. You know, that would be difficult. If you have kids, you live in public housing, you're working, you be home. So we went out there on a regular basis to make sure that people who wanted to participate in the research had opportunity to do so. And this built trust within the community. They know us. The community members embraced my staff and, really took care of them as they came out. And the final thing I want to talk about is that the strengths-based focused and how you can leverage what we call culture as intervention, understanding your community and understanding the community strengths. This is a project we started with Native Hawaiian men at Noke Olopono and Akane. It's a cultural approach to Kane and health dialogue. And this project started back in 2005 with a discussion among Native Hawaiian men about their health issues. And this is grounded in a cultural practice. In the Pacific Islander communities, the men prepare the meals. This is done in a central location in the village, which was called the men's house or the halimua. And the role of the halimua was to provide a venue for education and activities where men can learn how to sustain their families. So we kind of adapted this cultural norm and used it and introduced some cancer control education as part of what we call hua kuka kuka, or discussion groups among the men. So of course, we trained the men to deliver the intervention. I wasn't gonna go, and I'm not Native Hawaiians, but I wanted to train men in each community to lead the discussion groups. We had project materials that were designed for resource limited areas. Instead of having PowerPoints, we had flip charts that could go into, we delivered the session in garages and in really low resource settings where we could hold the discussions. We actually were fortunate to have Native Hawaiian physicians attend to answer any health questions. And our initial focus was on colorectal screening, tobacco use cessation, but we actually moved on having discussions with these men. They wanted some more information about sustaining their culture. So we built in some cultural education as part of the process. Project was highly successful. We went statewide. One of the things we wanted to do was to encourage men to take the FIT test who were over age 50. So we provided them with the opportunity to take the FIT test. We ended up having an 80% rate of men who were up to date with their colorectal screening who were part of the project, which is well above the 40% that we saw at baseline amongst Native Hawaiian men. So the last project I want to talk about, and I'll go through this really quickly, was the work in American Samoa. And this was really actually kind of a flip side, where the American Samoan Community Cancer Coalition led the development of grant writing and everything. And they had an idea that they wanted to build their research capacity. So they came to us as community researchers and recruited us to help them build a research infrastructure in American Samoa. This was a part of the formal introduction to the community. There, like I said, knowing the cultural norms. In American Samoa, you have to be really invited. And these were some of the dignitaries. The director of health came out, and this was an ava ceremony. This is a traditional practice. As you get introduced to the village, you have this ava ceremony where you are the village gets the opportunity to meet you, and they get to learn about why you're there and to build trust in that way. So one of the things about this, the idea was to establish resources to conduct scientific research. And, this community hit the ground running. They found a location in the center of American Samoa, the island, where it served as a place where people could come in and they can actually use some of the resources, the workstations. They had community meeting room. They had boardrooms and teleconferencing systems where we could actually conduct a training asynchronously with our recruits. So we trained a group of 4 master's level student and 1 doctoral level trainee using in-person and asynchronous learning platforms. And we've actually trained several more doctoral students since that time. And the proof is in the pudding. They put out manuscripts, 5 abstracts accepted to APHA, 4 abstracts accepted to APHA this past year. They actually been awarded at least 2 supplements in addition to the initial Inspire grant. And they have been highly successful in adopting and understanding and really building a research infrastructure in American Samoa. So finally, I wanted to place this in the context of COVID, involving the community. We recently got a grant, a RADx, Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics grant here in Hawaii. And we are in the process of really involving the community. We have convened a community advisory board, but we really need to understand the context of COVID from the Pacific Islander community. So we're actually going to be convening this community advisory board to get information about the effects of COVID, how it's perceived in the community, so we can develop ways to actually do some, at this point we're doing COVID-19 testing, but we hope to transition into COVID-19 vaccination as we move further into the 2-year project. This is our community advisory board. It's an eclectic group of people, academics, as well as community people, church members, and things like that. So we really want to have a broad swath of advisors who understand the community and who support us. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is sharing success and sharing our findings. I think this is really, really important. And we sometimes miss the mark as investigators. With all the studies that I have been involved with, if it is a community engagement, I actually invite community authors. Some of the community representatives from the advisory boards are invited to serve as authors to help, what we call member check some of the information that we're putting into the paper and actually give them an opportunity to be involved in academia. So these are some of the papers from the projects I mentioned. And, we have to understand too that community members don't read research articles. So we have to put and develop collateral that translates the research into a format that's, viable for community dissemination. So in addition to the papers, we actually create either print reports to the community that can be disseminated back to the community members. This is one for the Kane project. This was one for the Hawaiian homestay community that I showed. And these are other collateral that were developed based upon the community's needs, inputs, and what they wanted to have. Another way, it doesn't always have to be print. We actually hold celebration events. We actually invite community members in to see some of the scientists. It gives the opportunity for them to feel involved and be connected. We host these celebrations where we actually promote and talk about what has happened, some of the knowledge that is gained, and share it with the community. And I think it's really, really important to have that step for building sustainability and trust within community members. So in summary, these are some of the things, again, good intentions are not understand and be able to communicate your purpose for doing the research. Being able to translate what you're doing into plain language for community members, I think is important. Do your homework on your community, know the history, know some of the challenges. Next, once you do that, validate what you found in the literature with asking the community member, getting a champion, having that accountability through that champion to the community. Involve the community in your research as much as possible. Try to build a sustainable relationships with community members. I'm still working in communities that I've been working in since 2000. If I don't come and see them on a weekly or monthly basis, they put my face on the milk carton. It's like, where have you seen this guy? Where is he? And then share findings and successes. Invite new opportunities by sharing successes and getting input and feedback about your research and your directions with community members. So some of the current challenges in the Pacific, one of the misconceptions, that is often had is that we can just throw money. Now, there are not a lot of resources in the Pacific. So actually just giving funding or supporting funding does not always do the trick. It's not always the way to go about it. It's really having that boots on the ground and really getting there and rolling up your sleeves and being involved with community in the Pacific Islands. And, you know, I stand on the shoulders of giants, and these are some of my collaborators and community members that I've worked with, and, you know, my staff throughout the year. I wanted to just acknowledge, you know, that this is, again, it's a community process, and my training and my knowledge has been a part of a collaborative work with a lot of these people, partners, and communities. And I want to thank you for having me speak.